Alright, so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the first agricultural revolution and what that entails. And then get into a little bit of diet and nutrition, second ag revolution, and then you're going to meet my boy, Johann Heinrich von Thunen. So I'm going to start with this. Okay, we've talked a lot about hunting and gathering and what that entails. Why would hunters and gatherers decide to settle? Okay, when they've been following food, and experiment with agriculture? There's got to be a couple different reasons. Okay, so what I want you to do is take the first question. I want you to pause the video for a minute and think about and write down on your PowerPoint why you think these guys would decide to settle and try agriculture at that point. Take a moment. Okay, hopefully you paused and took a moment. If not, you're cheating. There's a couple different things. One, you stop and try to begin agriculture because you have enough food, you have surplus. That surplus is going to be important for you to be able to make experimentation. You can take some risks as time goes on. It's kind of like the idea of if I've got $5 billion, I'm willing to experiment with maybe 500 million into a new business. Because what's 500 million to a guy like, that has a 5 billion? Yep, drop in the bucket. The other thing is desperation. You've got nothing. So you're pretty much going to die anyway, so you might as well take the chance because it's your only potential option. For a lot of our hunters and gatherers, it was really the first one, that surplus concept. And what they do is, by now creating agriculture, is they start with plant domestication. Plant domestication is the modification of plants so that they need human interaction to survive. Okay? That plant domestication usually leads to bigger plants because a lot of what we're going to do is we're going to pick the best pieces of the plant to then replant. Seeds, usually, in those cases. This is all explained in a book by a guy named Carl Sauer, who you're going to want to know. And he explains the first agricultural revolution and its origins in this book, The Agricultural Origins and Dispersals, which is written in 1952. It is one of the most intriguing, mysterious, beautiful page-turning books you'll ever read. None of you will ever read it. I'm being sarcastic. If you ever have trouble sleeping, that's the book to read. Okay? But it's informative. And he really comes up with all these different centers of agricultural origin, so on and so forth. And he talks about two different types of agriculture creation. You have vegetative planting, which is known as root cropping. Root cropping really probably starts in Southeast Asia about 14,000 years ago, approximately. Seed agriculture, okay, is where you actually plant the seeds. And this really comes out of Southwest Asia or Fertile Crescent probably about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So root cropping is actually taking the cuttings of the plant or the roots of the plant, cutting them off after you're done with them, and then replanting them. This is what's sometimes known as tubers or things of that nature. Seed crops are literally taking seeds out of the actual product, your fruit, your vegetable, whatever it may be, and then replanting the seeds. That's your major difference between the two. So here's your vegetative planting herds, okay, your root crops. Really your Southeast Asia as a primary piece, okay, parts of Western Africa, South, okay, America, and then where they kind of travel from, okay, your Anatolia, okay, in terms of its spread, here as a secondary market, so on and so forth, okay. The primary hearth for a lot of your seed culture is going to come from places like Mesoamerica here, your Fertile Crescent, East Africa, parts of what would be Central Asia as we go forward, okay? And some of the different elements include your domestication of animals as well as we move forward here, okay? So like I said, your first real domestication of plants probably is about 14,000 years ago with root cropping, or what are known as tubers, okay? These are your taros, your yams, your bananas, those types of things. Then you have Southwest Asia with its first real seed crops, and that's your domestication of cereal crops or grasses, okay? Because pretty much a lot of what we eat are just simple types of grasses. Those include things like wheat, barley, oats, so on and so forth. Now, those are the ones we probably are most familiar with, but you see plants come from other places that we obviously use today. Like in Mesoamerica, you see the influence of maize or corn, squash, beans. Out of Africa, you see grains like millet and sorghum, as well as fruits like watermelons. Okay? And this just shows you kind of the importance of the Fertile Crescent at this point. Okay, the rise of groups out of Mesopotamia as we know them. Okay, the importance of like the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers to grow and move product. It generates a surplus for things like wheat, barley, so on and so forth. It's a lot of seed selection, which made the plants get bigger over time. And it's also where you start to finally see for the first time animal domestication as well. Just another map that kind of demonstrates this idea or this concept. So let's talk about domestication of animals. Okay, as people settled with agriculture, they used more domestication of animals as well. Why does that happen? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, okay? Animals become more domesticated because they're seen as pets in some cases. They're fun to have around. Ceremonial purposes, you got to sacrifice something. Probably not going to sacrifice a human. You know, some societies did at the time. They attach themselves as scavengers. Think about your dog sitting at your table, okay, looking for their food. And that would be a really good example of that. All these are different reasons you see that happen. Now, take a moment, pause the video after I'm done, and tell me what do you think happened to the animals when they were domesticated in terms of changes, shapes, sizes, things of that nature. If you pause and you wrote that information down, you'll probably notice that your animals used to get smaller when they get domesticated. Think about a wild horse versus a domesticated horse. Think about a domesticated wolf, which is what's called a dog. Okay, their bones get smaller. They're a little more brittle. They're going to become more docile. Okay, they're not going to be able to survive in the wild like a wild animal would. Okay, and that's important. You're not going to want to have some wild animal hanging out. Okay, if you're going to domesticate them and keep them around young children, people, so on and so forth. The other thing we talk about in 9.1 is the idea of the rise of importance in diet and nutrition. Okay, and there's 3 factors to nutrition. The level of development has an impact. Where is your country? Is it developed or developing? That can impact what type of nutrition you use, where you get your protein, so on and so forth. The physical conditions of your country, your climate, have an impact, and different cultural preferences, the impact of societal norms, religion, things of that nature can have an impact on the type of food you eat and what you'll have. Think about it. You have, certain dietary restrictions on different religious groups. Jews, okay, Muslims are a couple of those examples. Certain Christian groups, okay. The second piece here just talks about different cereal grains and their impact in terms of dietary consumption. You'll want to know these in terms of where they kind of show up. So the impact of wheat into Europe and North America, rice in the East, South, and Southeast Asia, maize into a lot of the world, but how much of it is not for human consumption. Okay, most of what you see when it comes to corn or maize isn't for you. And then sub-Saharan Africa has a lot of products that none of us would necessarily think about, like sorghum and millet. So there's a map there. I want you to look at this map, take a few moments, hey, and write down on the map on your PowerPoint just some of the different things that you notice from the map, okay, in terms of where certain energy sources of food are dominant, hey, and why that might be. If you pause this and took a moment to kind of think about that and look at that stuff, you'll probably notice that wheat is very dominant in general, especially in developed countries in terms of being a food energy source. Okay, but you also notice that in more northern climes, you see wheat going to be more important there. Your rice is going to be important in areas where you're going to have more wetlands in many cases. Your maize is going to show up in your Mesoamericas where it has more ability to actually develop. But you also see it in sub-Saharan Africa, okay, as a leading food energy source. And then there's other places where your other comes in. And that's where your millet and sorghum would probably play a part as well. Okay. Food security is just the idea that we have the ability to have access to safe and nutritious food all the time. Hey, not everyone has that. We have enough food, and I'm going to say this again, we have enough food to feed the world. But our food security isn't necessarily always there. Okay? And that's because of different physical, social, or economic conditions as time goes on. About 10% of the world's inhabitants do not have food security. They don't have enough to necessarily get through an active and healthy life on a daily basis. Protein becomes an important factor in that, especially in your growth, your maintenance. One of the things we talked about in terms of the difficulties of development and the difficulties of infant mortality rates and child mortality rates and things of that nature is malnutrition in mothers and children. If you remember from all the way back in population and migration. Well, this is part of what we're talking about here, that need for proteins. And where does your protein come from in these dietary concepts? Look at where you see meat, obviously being a bigger factor as the protein source versus different cereal crops. Okay? And that leads to this question here. Okay? Proteins from meat are a higher percentage in developed countries. So, what I want you to think about is why? What does that say about our dietary habits in developed countries versus developing countries? And is the fact that so much protein in terms of developed countries is coming from meat in developed countries, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Take a moment to answer some of those questions, because those are things that are going to show up on a test. Why does this happen? Why do you see this? You got to think this conceptually through, take it to the next step. Take a moment, pause the video, and write some thoughts to that question. All right, so hopefully you took some time to kind of think through some of these different things and different concepts. So that's going to end at this point the first ag revolution concept. Now, the first ag revolution really took a long period of time. The first ag revolution is essentially from about 14,000 years ago till about the 1700s, okay? Because most of our agriculture at that time was focused around subsistence, survival. The second ag revolution is going to see the transitional change from subsistence to the beginning of commercialization when it comes to agriculture. But it's also going to need a lot of help to get there. And a lot of what's going to help the second ag revolution is going to be the second urban revolution, which you've yet to learn about. You may yearn for it, who knows. And the rise of the industrial revolution, which you've heard a lot about, but you're going to get to know more as we go forward here. Those three things have to come together to make all of them work, okay? Innovation, mechanization, improvements in how we farmed are all going to allow for greater agricultural surpluses. Okay, it's going to lead to the Industrial Revolution, allowing us to move people off the farm because we didn't need as many farmers into the factories to continue to build. Hey, colonization is going to lead to new crops, hey, and development, things like potatoes and corn coming from the New World. Better soil preparation is going to be a factor, and then innovation. You see it in places like Western Europe. Two of those innovations are going to be crop rotation, okay? Crop rotation is just literally taking a plot of land, dividing it into quarters, and moving different crops around, very differentiated, diverse crops. And not planting the same crop in the same spot every year, but moving them around every couple of years so that you can continue to replenish nutrients, because certain nutrients are taken out and certain nutrients are put in by different plants. By moving the crops and rotating them, you're going to have a better chance of getting longer life out of your soil and your land itself. The seed drill is important because it's a device that is created to be able to be more precise in where you're planting your seeds at, to create more developed farmlands and be able to get more yield of your crop. Before, they would just plow lands and put seeds down, but it could be anywhere, okay, in terms of what was going on. It wasn't in these direct lines because that was very time-consuming and tedious. The seed drill just did it real quick. It just went boom, 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 right down the line. And as simple as that might seem today, it was a huge factor in growing our agriculture past subsistence to the beginnings of commercialization or surplus. The other thing that's going to be vitally important is the Great Britain Enclosure Act. What this did is essentially took your land, which is open spaces, and you have, cattle roaming and farm and collective and the whole thing on these big plots of land, and it started to individualize things. What it did is it started to literally put fences up and create plots of land that belonged to individualized farmers. You could now contain your animals much better. You can contain your plants much better. It is going to allow for more development of land, more individualized focus on their land because now it belongs to them, which is going to lead to more incentive to grow because it's going to help you make money. It starts to become a business more and more as time goes on here. Okay? So the beginning of this concept then becomes, with the Enclosure Act, okay, you're going to now have people making money off of this. You're going to see the rise of commercialization. You're going to need less farmers because you can now mechanize more because it's contained, and use machines to be able to farm. Okay, tractors, combines, so on and so forth. And now those people can go into the urban cities, or the beginning of the urban cities, and start to work in the factories. Okay, railroads are going to be a factor in that too, because now you can move agriculture to further and further away in terms of certain products, not all, but certain ones. Okay, so the second agri-revolution, which is going to be the early 1700s till about 1930s, is going to be a dramatic time in terms of moving us out of subsistence into commercialization. Colonization is also going to be a factor in that, and this is just an example of that with these tea plantations you see in periphery countries. Central America, Central Africa, all these different places see a lot of this concept, and we still see the impact of colonization with some of the plants that some of these different periphery, semi-periphery countries grow today. They're still growing for the developed areas, not the developing areas, even though they could use maybe some of those food sources. This leads to my guy. Okay, so let me talk about Johann. Johann Heinrich von Thunen is a German theorist who is really just studying land patterns. He loves his land patterns. And he notices an agricultural phenomena as the second agri-revolution hits. As we start to develop more land, and we start to develop moving away from subsistence to commercial agriculture, and we start to develop the marketplace, he starts to realize that going out from the central city, the market, to each new level, okay, you start to see a growth of different plants, different crops, different phenomena, because it could be animals too. And they really are contained into a certain area, a certain plot of land. The further you get away, the different crop that you're going to use there. And what he mapped was this idea that really there's a concentric set of rings where each crop dominates. One crop gives way to the next. And this is what's called von Thunen's, okay, land theories, okay? And the von Thunian model is going to be important to understand. You will use the von Thunian model the rest of the way. And this is the von Thunian model, okay? Von Thunen's model argued the idea that your central city was here. This is your marketplace, okay? All your trade and everything's going to happen here. Nearest the town, okay, we're going to be where you had your commodities like your perishables, okay? This land has got a lot of financial in it. So take a moment and think about what would be some of these perishables and write that down. Pause now. Okay. Hopefully you came up with things like dairying and eggs and any type of perishables. Perishables would be necessary to farm here because they couldn't go very far without spoiling. Okay. Second area is your forest. Okay. And it's just kind of a protection ring, things of that nature. Still a very, simple time. Out here, the further we got, you get to your less perishables, your bulkier goods and items to farm. So here would be your field crops. Your different grains would come out here. And then out here would be your ranching. Okay, here's your grazing area. Now, von Thunen's model really makes a certain point that's going to hold with every model we look at when it comes to urbanization. The further I get away from the city, the lower my land costs. Land gets less expensive out in the periphery here. But my transportation cost to get back to the city where I got trade is going to be more expensive. So there's an inverse relationship. Land costs decrease, transportation costs increase. The closer I get to the city, my transportation cost is going to decrease, but my land costs are going to increase. So this first circle is going to be my most expensive land, which is going to be important to a lot of people at that point because you want to have your most important pieces done there. And that's why your perishables are done in that location. The further out we get from town, we see more ranching, livestocking, the whole thing. And even today, even though von Thunen's theory and model, okay, isn't as easy to look at in a much more urban setting as we have now, you still see elements of it still today. If you go out east from Denver all the way to Nebraska, you can see each kind of area where there's more dairy and closer to Denver, and then you start getting further and further out. You see your intense grains, you're ranching out in Nebraska, the whole thing. There actually is very much still the von Thunian model in production or in usage. Okay, so I'm going to stop there at this point. Okay, and what I want you to think about is how the first agricultural revolution moves us into subsistence ag, and how that takes for so many years to be done, and then move out into the second ag revolution where we start to see the rise of commercialization. And how does colonialism, and this is the question I want you to be able to answer and think about this, and I want to be able to discuss this tomorrow. How does colonialism and colonialization lead us from the first ag to the second ag revolution, and from subsistence to commercialization? Okay, so you guys do that. Thank you for paying attention.